Good news, Canada! According to the Financial Post and StatCan, we've narrowly avoided a recession yet again, with GDP growth coming in slightly positive for the fourth quarter of 2023. But, as usual, it's still bad news when you dig into the underlying stats. So buckle up, friends, it's time for another Friday update with your old pal Millennial Moron. I've got 4 stories for you this week, including the first time I've interviewed someone for the Friday update, which is very exciting. Does this make me a journalist now? First up, we've once again narrowly avoided the technical definition of a recession, which is 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth, with growth coming in at an annualized rate of about 1% last quarter. As you may recall, we also just barely avoided a technical recession 3 months ago, when we had a second consecutive quarter of negative GDP growth, but were fortunately saved from a recession by a revision of the data from the previous quarter from negative to slightly positive. Unfortunately, as we've been seeing for about a year and a half now, this increase in GDP has mainly been driven by population growth rather than real economic activity. While overall GDP grew by 1% at an annualized rate, the population grew at a rate of 4.4%, meaning our growth in real GDP per capita was negative 3.2% on an annualized basis. While we've seen declines in real GDP per capita before, this one is a bit concerning to me because it's been sustained and steep. We're now back to where we were at the beginning of 2017, or even as far back as the end of 2014 before the recession in early 2015. Now, the frequently cited reasons for needing such a rapid increase are the labor shortage, which, as I've discussed before, I'm not convinced actually exists, and needing more people to spur economic growth in order to cover the costs associated with the aging demographic cohort of baby boomers. However, to me, this raises a pretty obvious question, which is, if covering social programs and replacing baby boomers in the workforce requires the population to grow so quickly that we're persistently seeing a drop in GDP per capita, what's going to happen to the younger demographic 30 or 40 years down the line? It's going to become exactly the same problem, just much larger. That solution is absurd to say, borrowing money against your home equity to keep making payments on your mortgage. It might work for a little bit, but in the long run, it's not a real solution, and it's just going to make the situation worse. The other interesting thing about the baby boomer issue is that it may not even exist. In a column published on Thursday, economist Don Wright described this constant policy focus on the aging cohort as baby boom derangement syndrome, which is the funniest term I've ever heard for it. He points out that a big part of the concern with the baby boomer generation outnumbering millennials is just how it's measured. StatCan uses a 20-year period of births to define baby boomers, but only 15 years for millennials. However, if you define both generations as a 20-year span, millennials actually outnumbered baby boomers 10 years ago, which makes the claims of a looming demographic crisis a bit suspect. Whatever way you look at it, I think the key problem here is that we're always taking a short-term view of these issues, trying to solve our immediate problems by any means necessary. But in my opinion, that just leads to a situation where we're constantly scrambling from crisis to crisis. We need to start taking a longer view on these kinds of issues and think about how what we do right now will be affecting things 10, 30, or even 50 years out. Next, BC is implementing a new home flipping tax where homes sold within a year of being purchased will be taxed at 20%, with the rate gradually decreasing to 0 after the home has been owned for 2 years. It's certainly not the worst idea they've ever had, but some people might say that this is shutting the door after the horses have already left the barn. Some people might say that the horses have not only left the barn, but they ran all the way down the highway, down to the border, crossed over late at night, with no passports on account of because they're horses. They eventually made their way down to Montana, gave themselves fake names, settled down, got jobs, bought a house because they could afford it there. They even started a family. Generations passed in horse years. And now if you go down there and you find yourself an elderly gray horse and you tell her, hey, you'll never guess what happened. Vancouver just put in a flipping tax on houses. And she'd say, "Oh, Vancouver? Great-grandpapa used to tell us stories about the old country." And you'd say, "Wow, horse, that's incredible. I didn't even know you could talk." Anyway, naturally the BC Real Estate Association doesn't think this is a good idea. But as I've said in other videos, the real estate board disliking a policy is probably an indicator that it's actually a fantastic idea. Basically, the chief economist for the BC REA is arguing that this won't actually bring in that much revenue, it won't affect a huge number of homes, and that this policy alone is not enough to make housing affordable again. At the risk of editorializing, this is a line of argument that I'm really getting sick of, where people who are against a policy because of a vested interest that they have, in this case because home flipping makes a lot of money for realtors, they then criticize the policy by saying it won't solve all of our problems on its own, and pretend that their concern is about how effective the policy will be, and not because it has the potential to cut into their profits. The point here obviously isn't for the government to bring in a bunch of tax money from homes that are currently being flipped. The point is to create a disincentive for property speculators to buy a house with the intention of flipping it in the first place. Yes, obviously this one action won't fix all of our problems, but that's true of any policy, because this problem is too large and has too many layers to be solved by flipping a single switch. That doesn't mean that the right answer is to do absolutely nothing. We can do more than one thing in our strategy to address the housing crisis, and taking each policy out of that context and examining it in a vacuum is pointless. These people really need to learn the phrase yes and. Just go down to your community college, take one improv class, and then come back and apply that same energy to problem solving. Hamilton, Ontario is back in the news as well, with city councillors voting down a development that would have created 67 affordable housing units in order to save 27 parking spots in a portion of a surface level parking lot. Opposition to the plan focused on the dire need for parking in order for people to patronize businesses and attend events downtown, which is a good point, really. I mean, how are people supposed to drive downtown when they already live downtown? So, congratulations, ham dogs! Can't wait to see what you come up with next. Recently, you may have seen this headline in the news talking about how Tarion has estimated they'll be paying out $90 million this year in coverage for lost deposits on new build homes as waves of builders in Ontario are abandoning projects and entering bankruptcy. This is an enormous increase from a typical annual total of well under $2 million. The story also mentions that despite this coverage provided by Tarion, homebuyers who are affected by these abandoned projects may still lose a significant portion of their deposits. But you're probably wondering, what the heck is Tarion? Tarion is the organization responsible for administering Ontario's new home warranty program. This includes problems with new homes still under warranty by the builder, dispute resolution, and in this case, providing some coverage of funds deposited on new build homes in the event that the builder fails to complete the project. They also used to be responsible for licensing builders in the province of Ontario until those responsibilities were spun off into a new entity called the Home Construction Regulatory Authority, or HCRA. But before reading this article, most people probably hadn't even heard of Tarion, including me. I don't know everything, it just looks like I know everything because I do a bunch of research before I write the videos, okay? Anyway, to find out more about Tarion and the HCRA, and to find out why homebuyers in Ontario could still be at risk of losing large amounts of their deposit money despite the existence of these two organizations, I had a chat with Barbara Captijn, a consumer advocate who's been studying this issue and advocating for consumer protections for Ontario homebuyers for the past 15 years. The amount of deposit payouts that they're projecting for this year is $90 million, which is much higher than a typical year where they're typically about 1.2 to 1.6 million. What's causing such a huge increase right now?
We, as consumer advocates, have been telling the government and telling Tarion and its spin-off agency, HCRA, for over a decade that there are not enough consumer protections in this legislation governing these agencies in order to protect consumers. Furthermore, there's not enough government oversight of these two agencies. So the average new home buyer isn't going to be expected to understand all the intricacies of the legislation governing these two agencies, and they wouldn't be aware of some of the loopholes and gaps in the protections that Tarion provides. And for example, one of them is that if you buy a freehold home that is not a condominium, it could be a townhouse or a freestanding new construction home, your deposit does not have to be held in trust with a lawyer. That is not the law. It's not mandatory. And most consumers wouldn't think, oh, I think I'll ask that be done. That should be the law.
My understanding of the deposit coverage by Tarion is that for freehold homes, it would be 10% of the total purchase price of the home up to $100,000. So it seems like, people who have put down more than $100,000, either because the home cost more than $1 million or because their deposit requirement was more than 10%, will still be on the hook for some of the difference. They could still lose some of their deposits. So if we're looking at $90 million in payouts from Tarion, there could be, I would assume, tens of millions of dollars hanging in the balance that won't be covered.
Yes, developers can ask however much deposit they want. The contracts are written by developers for pre-construction new homes. They're not written by a collaboration between all the parties. The spin-off agency from Tarion, created in 2021, called HCRA, or the Home Construction Regulatory Authority, they're supposed to license builders and only license them if they have checked that they have sound financials and have the ability not only to collect deposits from people, but to actually build what they contract to build. And they are also dropping the ball here, because how can a builder go bankrupt a year after he's got his license renewed by the very agency who's responsible for checking his financial stability in the first place?
Yeah, I really see what you mean about a train wreck in slow motion. And I think we've seen this across many different aspects of the industry, is that there are a lot of these problems out there with poor oversight and just poor monitoring of all sorts of things. But when prices are going up rapidly and everyone's making money hand over fist, it doesn't become a problem. But you can see if there's no protections built into the situation, then when things change,
Exactly.
there's no coverage really.
Exactly. And that's when you need somebody to step in to protect the consumer. business person I used to know said, revenues hide a multitude of sins. When everybody's making money and everybody's happy, nothing much is going to happen. But you have agencies like Tarion and HCRA in the event that there should be a downfall in the market and there should be problems.
We have these projects being canceled. We have builder corporations going bankrupt. Many of them weren't even registered with Tarion to begin with. And we have a lot of buyers out there who are not going to have their deposit fully covered by Tarion. So, without those deposits being held in trust anywhere, do these buyers have any recourse?
Well, no, except if you've got a lot of money and a lot of time, you can try to sue the builder in court. But nobody I've ever met has the money to pay lawyers $800 an hour or $600 an hour and to wait through a long, complex court procedure for 3 years or 4 or more. And at the end of the day, you don't have your house either.
This also ties back into a story that you may have heard about last year, which was the collapse of Stateview Homes. They had taken tens of millions of dollars in deposits on hundreds of homes that they didn't actually have authorization to sell. The regulator claimed that getting authorization to sell is the builder's responsibility, but some people might say that when a company is building hundreds of homes and taking tens of millions of dollars in deposits, the regulator might want to text them and check if they got a license. By the way, if you want to hear the full 15-minute interview with Barbara, I posted it on my channel yesterday, and it's a good listen if you want more of a deep dive into this story. That's all for this week, so thanks for watching and enjoy your weekend.